Welcome to Think to Film Podcast, where we read the book.
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Hayao Miyazaki's 2004 anime film, Howl's Moving Castle. Now let's change into a giant demon bird and take on some airships.
Welcome to our final episode on our coverage of Howl's Moving Castle. To finish it out, we are going to do the 2004 anime film by Hayao Miyazaki. It's also Thanksgiving time, so happy Thanksgiving, and happy Thanksgiving to you, Luke.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you and our listeners. This movie is a nice family fun kind of thing that I think is appropriate for the holiday. It's about a found family, right? A popular trope that I think always warms the heart. And the movie, to me, leaned even more heavily into that than even the book did.
Yeah, and it is a common trope for the family to be, because it's everybody has a family, you know, in one way or another, whether it's biological or not. And something that Miyazaki does very well, which is Hayao Miyazaki directed this film, and it's based on the novel that we covered by Diana Wynne Jones. And, you know, he made it his own by putting his own spin on it in some ways. But I feel like what Hayao Miyazaki does very well is he takes simple, to the point storytelling elements, and he presents them in a way that you kind of aren't expecting. And he does it in a way that has such artistic mastery around it that it's almost, I mean, his films are almost universally loved. I've never met someone who doesn't like one of his films.
Yeah, that's a good point. And specifically, found families, I think, appeal to people because a constructed family in some ways can be even more powerful than the one you're born into, because you get to choose that new family, right? But a new family that you have this really strong tie to is something everyone can appreciate and want to have in their life. And I think, you know, a lot of times people find this stuff through like fandoms, right? And the communities that build up around the things they love. You could start to piece together this sort of found family with your best friends or whatever that might be. And I think as viewers or readers, we love to see that.
Definitely. And a lot of Hayao Miyazaki's films kind of lean into that, and there's some common themes throughout a lot of his films. Before we jump into like the specifics of this film, I just wanted to cover a little bit of Hayao Miyazaki. He's the mastermind behind Studio Ghibli. He's worked closely with Miramax and then Disney in order to bring the films to a wider audience.
Have you seen all of his films?
Yeah, I've seen all of them. You know what? I've seen all except for, there's like a Lupin the Third film that I haven't seen, that it kind of doesn't really fall under the Ghibli banner, but I think he did direct it, so I haven't seen that one.
I've seen only a few. Like I've seen this, I've seen Spirited Away, Nausicaa, Princess Mononoke, but I barely remember that one. And I think that's it. I might be forgetting one or two others I have seen, but I think that's all I've seen. I know there's a bunch I have not seen.
Yeah, there's a lot of other, Kiki's Delivery Service, Ponyo, Wind Rises. Wind Rises is one I think you should definitely check out.
I haven't seen any of those. So if you're a big fan of Howl's Moving Castle, which I am, what other Hayao Miyazaki film would you most recommend? And to me, which one that I haven't seen would you most recommend?
Okay, so I know that you've seen Spirited Away. Spirited Away is the one that I'm going to recommend, whether or not you like. I mean, that's just the film, in my opinion. That was his masterpiece.
Absolutely love that movie.
All the rest of them are like very, very close, but that one just is in a league of its own, in my opinion. The next up after that, I really like Princess Mononoke. Is like right there with kind of the themes that are in this movie, and I feel like if you like this movie, you would definitely like that one.
I need to rewatch that one because I barely remember it, so I'm going to count that almost as one I haven't seen.
So Hayao Miyazaki was born in Tokyo in 1941, so there was something fairly significant that happened to Japan in the 40s from World War II. There was bombs dropped on Japan, nuclear bombs, well, atomic bombs. He grew up in the world that was kind of reacting to that, right? He was a young kid, and you know, elders were probably talking about this around him, and you can kind of see that in a lot of his films. He's got a lot of like environmentally friendly messages. He's got a lot of anti-war messages. What I think makes Miyazaki particularly special is his meticulousness and his work ethic and the craftsmanship that goes into everything that he does.
Those themes are absolutely present in this film, more so than the book, I would say. You can look at scenes where Sophie's sitting out and enjoying the view and the talk about the environment and all these beautiful scenes that show the environment. And you juxtapose that against the way he depicts war and how dark and explosive and just destructive it all is. And I think there's even a line where Sophie asks, how are those ships ours or theirs? Or are those ours? Essentially, like, are they our country's ships? And he says, it doesn't, what does it matter? It doesn't matter. So that really plays into the idea of war being bad regardless. So it doesn't matter if it's your country doing it. It's still bad.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you looked into kind of this film in general, but Miyazaki has come out on his own, and people have always assumed that this film came out in 2004, and it was kind of Miyazaki's response to the Iraqi invasion in 2003. And there's a lot of that at play. And there's actually, there's a scene in this film where somebody mentions in the newspaper, there's something about the war being over, and then somebody else comments that only a fool would believe that. And so it's kind of just the idea that, like, just because a newspaper says it's over, just because somebody says it's over, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won or that things went well or that it was a good thing that we did that.
Yeah, I found that part of this movie particularly topical. There was definitely a propaganda element where you even see flyers dropping from the airships like they used to do in World War II. And there's definitely an element of not being able to believe what your government is telling you, and you don't want to just listen to the official state record of things. And in a world with fake news is such a big deal these days, and news networks of debatable veracity for their stories that they put out, and credibility, from whatever side you take, that's absolutely something that's topical right now, and especially in America.
Definitely. So here at Ink to Film, we like to compare the novels to the film. So I guess we should talk about some of the things that were different from the novel and the film.
So I just wanted to say this is all going to be non-spoiler type talk, and then we will get to an eventual section where spoilers are fair game.
Yeah, you're right.
So if you're worried about being spoiled, this is going to be fine for you. This is safe, and then eventually we'll have you turn it off if you're worried about that. If you haven't seen the movie,
right? We'll let you know when spoilers are coming up, but as of now, we're going to try to stay away from those. As far as difference from the novel to the movie here. There is a sort of a steampunk aesthetic, and also I don't know, because the author of the novel, Diana Wynne Jones, is English, and this seems to have kind of a French aesthetic going on with the score and or at least in my opinion, it felt like very French score and like architecture. And I believe we watched the behind the scenes. I watched the behind the scenes as well as you, right? And they talked about that, kind of how Miyazaki went out to kind of do some research on this kind of architecture, because a lot of what they do is hand drawn and frame by frame hand drawn. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's part of it's just him wanting to put his own spin on it. I was glad they included the interview with the author, because as an author myself, I cringe a little bit when I see Hayao Miyazaki and the people over at Pixar, having this big release and talking about this film, and like I keep thinking, like, nowhere in there is anyone mentioning the author's name who came up with these concepts, and I get a little frustrated with that, but it's clearly I'm in a minority there because I am a content creator in that way, and I worry about that, but they did a good job, and they included the interview with her. It doesn't say it prominently when the title card appears. I took a picture of it. It does say, adapted by or inspired from Diana Wynne Jones' story.
I'd never noticed that before, because I'm not really sure why I never noticed it, but like I said in our past episodes, I didn't realize this was even a novel until you said something about doing it for the podcast. So I noticed that this time that her name is there in the title card.
Yeah, and it's funny how we do that, right? We don't necessarily think about that. And this podcast has changed, even more so. I look for those now. I look for that kind of acknowledgement of a different work that it's being adapted from. But yeah, like I was saying, I think they did do a good job giving her the credit she deserves. And I like to see that interview, which we can talk more about at some point, I guess, or maybe at the end.
Something else that I noticed in this film is the difference in themes. Because we're dealing with, in her novel, it's kind of coming into your own, accepting yourself, and while also being a fairy tale fantasy. And it felt like here in the film we were dealing with more of it felt like for me more of a romantic love story, war kind of story, anti-war story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all true, and like I said, I think that's Hayao Miyazaki putting his own spin on it, and bringing in those themes that he's famous for, and making sure that while he is adapting a work, which I don't know that he has done any other time other than this one, that may not be true, but that, as far as I understand it, and he's taking this adapted work, but he has such a clear artistic vision himself that I think he wanted to make sure he's infusing this story and making it his own. And I think all these differences are his way of doing that.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to mention before we jump into the actual story and spoilers here is the voice acting. Did you watch the film in English or Japanese?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure, English.
So in the English version of the film, we have a lot of famous voices. We have Christian Bale, we have Billy Crystal, Gene Simmons. And I just wanted to get your take on that because I also watched the Japanese version, and I feel like there are a few voices in the American version that aren't quite there. Like I felt like I got more out of the Japanese version. Was there any discrepancy in the voices for you?
So I like Christian Bale. I'm a fan of his work in general. He's not my favorite actor or anything by any stretch. As much as I'm glad they got this big name, I feel like he's kind of an unsteady fit for me for Hal. Sometimes he really nails it, and I think he's perfect. But I think, like, especially early on, I find him jarring from the character model and the voice that Christian Bale has. Like, he's a little bit too macho sounding, I guess, is something about it that's striking me wrong. For Hal, who doesn't seem quite as gruff, like I expect him to have a beard when I hear Christian Bale's voice. Like, there's just something that is a little off. And I mean, that's going to be true for any American, portraying a character who's not drawn to look American or, Western or what have you. But ultimately, I think it's still a good fit, and he does some nice work, especially when he transforms. There are some times where I think he does really work. The other note I wanted to have about the voice actor is, did you notice that Josh Hutcherson plays the kid, Michael? So he's not named Michael in this. He's like
Markle.
Mikhail or something, right?
Markle, yeah.
Markle.
He, I didn't realize until I saw online that he had played that role. So, and when I saw his name, I recognized him. But I thought it was funny that he was so young and playing that young character.
Yeah. So if you don't know, he's Pita from Hunger Games, right? Famously.
He actually has a new show out that I'm interested in checking out. It's like Future Man or something, and he some people come from the future and take him back in time. So it's kind of a Back to the Future type thing.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I thought it was funny to see him, and then if you watch that behind the scenes footage, he's on there talking, and he is a like 8-year-old kid, and it's funny to see him that young. I don't know. I thought it was pretty funny. Yeah,
it's pretty wild. I agree with you on the Christian Bale part. He was the kind of the outlier for me because I think Billy Crystal as Calcifer is a standout performance, and I think Christian Bale just. He did fine, he did. It was a fine performance. But I don't think he brought his Christian Bale-ness to the role. Like I feel like in a lot of ways, like The Fighter and American Hustle and The Machinist, like he does these interesting roles. I guess a lot of that is just like fluctuation in weight, but it seems like he's able to really, really embody those characters. And in this, it kind of just felt like he was just like went into a booth and was recording the lines, and then other times he was really getting into it.
You know, you speak about standouts, and I think we'd be remiss to not mention Gene Simmons and Lauren Bacall both. I think both of them knock it out of the park. Gene Simmons playing the old Sophie. That voice is just so perfect for that character model and for the role. I think she just did a great job. And then Lauren Bacall is the witch, the witch of the waste, you know, and she doesn't have as many lines or anything, but when she's on screen and she walks into that hat shop early on, and, you know, her voice is, I don't know, it's really menacing, but just really fits the character.
I agree. Yeah, they're amazing. The lot of the, like I said, a lot of the cast really, really, really killed it, and I felt like just Christian Bale didn't pull his Christian Bale normal weight that I would expect, you know. And I will say, as far as the Japanese actors, having watched a lot of Japanese subtitled anime, they all did an amazing job. There's something they add so much emotion in their voices a lot of the times, and I don't know, to maybe someone who hasn't had as much experience, it might seem like they're going over the top, but there's something about it that really sticks with me.
Yeah, you know, and I haven't seen that version, so I can't really speak on it, but yeah, that's interesting. I did want to say the Billy Crystal casting, I think, is a little bit controversial from what I've read. Seems like people are hot and cold on it. You know, a lot of people love it. A lot of people think it really fit. And then a lot of people, I think it's jarring almost because they can't not picture Billy Crystal. And it's just him as a fire. Like you know what I mean? Like he wasn't really acting so much as just speaking as a fire and yeah, as Calcifer. And I get that criticism. I think I'm one of the few people who maybe falls somewhere in the middle. Like I think he's pretty good. I don't know if I'm prepared to say that he is a standout for me. I thought he did well with it, but I think I appreciate the that possible criticism that he wasn't maybe acting as much as some of the other characters or other actors are.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't know. He really fits the role for me, and maybe it's just that I really enjoyed him as a kid, and I have that nostalgia for the role blinding me. But he's the voice of Mike Wazowski in Monsters, Inc., and both of these films came out around that same time. And I think Pixar knew what they were doing when they were like, okay, kids really enjoyed Mike Wazowski, so let's get Billy Crystal back for the English dub of Howl's Moving Castle. All right, so I think we're ready to jump into spoilers here. What we're going to do is just run through the plot, kind of talk it out, and I think we will comment a lot on things that are different from the novel, so be on the lookout for that. So it opens similarly from the book. Sophie Hatter works in a hat shop for her mother, and she has a sister, Letty, who works at a bakery.
All right, before we get to that, I gotta back up a little bit to the title card and the castle walking out of the mist there. I know not a lot plot-wise is happening, but I think that establishes a big difference for me because I can hear the sound of this castle, which is perfect to me. It's like creaking and groaning, and there's steam shooting out of it, and it seems like a living creature. And when it comes walking out of the mist on this mountainside, it's just iconic. And Miyazaki's version of the moving castle is a work of art. And yeah, I don't know. It's just something I couldn't let go by without at least mentioning it.
It's so funny because word for word in my notes, verbatim wrote down iconic shot. Like you were saying, it does open with there's that mist that clears with the shepherd in the field, and just having it reveal Howl's Moving Castle is unbelievable. I mean, like you say, it is different than the novel, but a welcome difference. I think it's amazing.
It's something that's been brought to life in a way that your imagination fills in these gaps when you read, and that creates a very unique experience for the person reading it and experiencing it, because you're kind of coming halfway to meet the writer. But it's going to be a different thing than when you see it brought to life, given sound. You see this artistic vision on the screen.
Definitely. And it kind of sets up this steampunk aesthetic that we see throughout. We see a lot of this because it seemed like her novel was more medieval, more early. And this is kind of has that technology pushing with magic.
Yeah, I don't remember how many. I don't think there was any horseless carriages. There was definitely no flying airships. And I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead of you a little bit, but there's a parade going on, and there's all these soldiers who are going off to war, and there's all this fanfare, and we're seeing these big ships, and one after another, and this row of tanks going by. And I thought it was interesting that he's setting up, like, it's a very ominous thing too, because while everyone's celebrating it, I think the way he draws them, especially the tanks, because they're very dark and very fearsome looking, he's setting up this idea of just the horror of war, and we can see like something big is coming because of this.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's kind of the glorification, right? Like there's a parade going on, and everybody's happy, and the soldiers are proud, and it just seems like probably not the best thing to be doing. Like, yes, it can be necessary, but it just seems like putting too much emphasis on that being a good thing can lead into, your military complexes and that kind of thing.
I mean, I mean, you look around the world, this still goes on, and to a lesser extent maybe in America, but big military parades, it harkens to a lot of stuff you see in World War II, whether it's from Germany or China or Japan, and soldiers marching in lockstep, and tanks rolling by, and how that, I think, is a very complicated, fraught image.
Well, yeah, because it's very important to support the troops and the sacrifices that they're making. And I mean, there can't be enough said for that. It's that is a thing that we should be we're eternally grateful. But it becomes an issue when there's other things at bay, other powers that are kind of deciding how those are received by the public.
Yeah, and it's nationalism run rampant when you, maybe in the guise of supporting the troops, you can ignore what your government may be doing, and whether or not the wars that your troops are fighting are just ones and worth it, and worth the destruction that they're going to inflict. And it's kind of impossible to not get a little political talking about it, but I that's the way I read it, and it seems to me very much don't wrap yourself in in the flag and ignore the reality of what's happening.
Well, it's love your country, love the troops, be skeptical of the government, right? Kind of that's kind of what I got from it.
Yeah, and I think the number one way to support the troops is to make sure that when they're going into battle, it's for the right reasons, and it's a just war. So,
agreed. So Sophie actually leaves the hat shop, and she's walking through these soldiers in this parade, and she's heading towards Letty at the bakery. And some soldiers stop her, and they're kind of flirting with her in a forceful way, and I
don't know if I'd call it flirting. Yeah, being creeps. They're creeping on her.
It's definitely forceful, unwelcomed, unwarranted.
They're basically catcalling her and harassing her on the street.
Right.
Which anybody who lives in a big city knows is a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Flamboyantly dressed man shows up with like a cloak on and saves her and says, "Come with me. She's with me, guys," kind of thing.
Yeah, he actually says "Oh, there you are, honey." And right. She goes along with it and is fine with it, but that in and of itself is also a little weirdly presumptuous. And ultimately he's kind of saving the day in this moment, but this also is kind of a different, separate point. When he first shows up and he's very flamboyantly dressed and he's blonde and he's he looks how he looks. When he opens his mouth and Christian Bale's voice comes out, that was one of the first times where I'm like, oh, I don't know if this fits. And I think it grows on me over time, but immediately I'm like, that doesn't sound like this character.
I agree. I think early on is when I also felt the resistance to it. Like I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll get on board with this. And eventually I think it pays off in the end. Like I think he does a good job, like I say. Yeah. So we find out that this is the wizard Howl because he grabs her arms and they jump into the air and they walk in the air. They are literally walking above the buildings. And we also see that there's some sort of like ooze slime monsters that are after him. So she pulled him away from the soldiers just to get chased by slime monsters. They get away while walking through the air, and he drops her off at the bakery, and he says, "I'll lure the slimy guys away."
Yeah, I mean these shadow slime monsters, whatever they are, really cool. Creations of some sort from the Witch of the Waste. It's really kind of funny. I think this and later, these creatures all wearing hats. It's just like, I don't know, weird detail that I find humorous.
They're all in uniform too. So Sophie meets up with her sister Letty, and she's telling Letty about Howl, who just saved her, and she says, you need to be careful because Howl, like in the novel, he eats women's hearts. She specifically says beautiful women's hearts, and Sophie says something about how she doesn't need to worry because she doesn't feel like she doesn't see herself as beautiful, which kind of setting up this character of being not very confident in her like outward appearance, and it's kind of affecting her inward appearance. So she leaves this shop.
I think this is also something that, both the novel and the movie do well that make this character so appealing, probably particularly to young women. And it's the idea that, the more plain, quote unquote, woman is perhaps self-conscious about her appearance, but maybe, prettier than she seems. But again, this also feels a little bit problematic to me because there's a lot of weight in this universe placed on, beauty equating to quality, equating to goodness. And we'll get into it more later, but I think this is also juxtaposed against the witch, who is very ugly and is very fat. And her fatness almost seems to equate with being evil and being ugly on the inside. So even though the old woman part of it turns it on its head a little bit, and I'm glad that's in there, there is a little bit of this thing that makes me a little uncomfortable, being that if you're an ugly person, you're an ugly human being, and you're bad. And if you're beautiful, like Hal, then you're a good person.
I think as the story goes, they kind of try to get a little bit away from that, because Hal stops worrying about how he looks and his potions and all that kind of thing, and he kind of goes through that. And Sophie as well, by the end, I don't think she kind of gets over the image feelings that she has of herself. But like you say, it's still a lot of it. Like you said, the witch is large, so she's evil. So that can be definitely seen as problematic, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So Sophie leaves Letty's bakery and she heads back to the shop. And when she gets to the shop, she's kind of closing up, and a woman shows up. She is just in the store, and Sophie basically says, "We're closed. Get out. We're just a little shop." And the witch is kind of offended by this, and we find out that this is the Witch of the Waste, calling her the witch. And she says, "I can't believe you would treat the Witch of the Waste like this." And she kind of flies through her, leaving a curse spell on her. And as she leaves, she says two things. She says, "You won't be able to tell anybody about this curse, and also send my regards to Hal." And she leaves. What we're left with is Sophie as an old woman, and she looks in the mirror. And even in the novel, she wasn't as affected, but in the movie, she's still just like, okay, I'm old now. She accepts it within like, a day or so, and then she ends up leaving.
She does have a funny kind of freak out moment at first, though, that I really liked, where she looks in the mirror and says, and it has she jumps, and then she says, oh my God, this is what I look like. And then she like paces around telling herself, don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. And then like looks in the mirror again and has the same reaction. It's played for laughs, and I think it works. And maybe a slightly more believable reaction to it than we necessarily got in the book.
She does something early on that I think she does as an old woman as well, where she pulls her hat over her head in a specific way. And that just reminded me of something I wanted to say about Miyazaki, is that he's so detail-oriented with his characters, with the story as a whole. And I was listening to an interview or reading an article or something talking about his process in characters, and what he does in the animation is he gives each character a specific habit that they'll do. So in Spirited Away, you'll see the character kick when she puts her shoes on. She kicks her toes on the ground to make sure that her feet are like fully set in her shoes. And something that I see Sophie do a lot in this is pull her hat down in a very specific way. And it's just something that gives, like, it's an action that gives the character uniqueness. It gives it makes them have that certain trait. And I just think that's genius. I just think that's something that, like, any character that I create from here till whenever, I'm always going to be thinking about that. That's affected the way that I think of visually what a character does on screen. giving them like I don't want to. It's not a tick, but it's a certain motion that they repeat a lot, and it's part of their character.
I mean, it's cool, and I'm glad that you have such a positive look at it. That is something that writers do as well, and it's I think it's a cool thing. It can also be seen as kind of a cheat, but I think that's silly to think of it that way. But the point being is, I mean, we see this in It that we covered a long time ago. Characters have little quirks, and those little quirks can kind of define them, and
Right.
they're always present when you're reading about that character, and it grounds you to that person. Even if it's something as simple as a stutter or, a physical appearance trait or whatever it might be.
In a novel, I think it's a little more apparent because the writer has to tell you that it's happening, whereas it's like passively happening in a film where it's like you might not even notice that she does it the whole film.
Right.
And it's something so subtle. But if it's overplayed, if you overplay your hand, it can lead into the fact that the character is on the nose. The reader knows what you're trying to say with the character. So Sophie is now an old woman, and she realizes that she shouldn't stay in the hat shop. She realizes that she should just leave, and she heads toward the countryside. She approaches multiple different people, and she finds different ways out of the city and up into the hills. And I mean, the landscapes is another thing in Miyazaki's films that I just like. I think a lot of his like large establishing shots can be your background on your phone, can be your background on your computer. They're all just like amazing. And so we're in the hills, and she comes along, Scarecrow, who she pulls out of the bushes.
Before you got to the Scarecrow thing, I just wanted to say, because before I leave it in the dust, there is a scene early on with monsters that the witch summons, carrying her in this palanquin, and it makes this sound. And so I watched the film with my wife, and she mentioned it. She goes, "I hate the sound it makes," and it makes this like weird creaky sound whenever they're like walking, and I don't know, whatever it is, it's unsettling, right? And we see them kind of like comically carrying it around. And the other thing that's funny about it is it's this tiny little box, and she's like spilling out of it whenever she opens the window to talk. Like she barely fits inside of it. But yeah, I don't know, really interesting, kind of cool detail. And I love what Miyazaki does there, because that's not in the book at all. All right, so Turnip Head, who I love in the movie, he is fantastic. He immediately wins us over by, I don't know, just doing cool things and bringing her an umbrella, or that's later. What does he bring her? Oh, he brings her the cane here, hopping along after her. Their relationship is immediately really winning and interesting to me.
And much different than the film, because she's afraid of
than the book.
Much different than the book, because she's afraid of him in the book. And yeah, so she effectively saves him. She pulls him out of the bushes, and like you were saying, he eventually brings her a cane, and then she sarcastically says, "Now just bring me a house to sleep in." And next thing you know, there's a moving castle over top of her, and she knows that it's Howl's moving castle, and she sees the entrance. This Turnip Head is jumping near the entrance, so she heads to the entrance and climbs in.
And speaking of this part, in both the book and the movie, I really wanted her motivation to be, I'm going to go to the waste and find Howl and tell him I've been cursed, or try and see if he can lift this curse, even though I can't tell him, obviously, that I've been cursed. But we don't really get that in either version. And in this version, I thought, okay, they're going that route. But then again, she kind of talks about it like she doesn't expect it. And I get that she doesn't necessarily realize that the man who saved her from the creeps is Howl, but the witch does say, "Give my regards to Wizard Howl." So it seems like as a character motivation, she could have this thought of, I'm going to go seek out this wizard. And I don't know, it seems like a missed opportunity to give Sophie some agency there, whereas her wandering into the waste continues to feel a little bit bizarre to me, like irresponsible. Like, what is she going to do in the waste? Like, what is her plan?
Yeah, I didn't really think about that. Because for some reason, my brain just put two and two together that she was going to find Howl. And it's not like she never, she isn't. Because like you say, she's surprised to see Howl's moving castle. So that is kind of an oversight a little bit, right? Like why not just, it would have been easy just to say, I'm going to look for Howl because he's a wizard who can save me.
Yeah, and it changes her character ever so subtly, because instead of her taking her own situation into her own hands and saying, I'm going to go and try and fix it, she gets swept up in kind of an adventure that is beyond her control.
Maybe it's because they want her to be more of a surrogate for they want the audience to experience what she's experiencing. So it's like if she was going to look for Howl, we would have already known that what her plan was, and it's like a little more.
Yeah, it's also, but I mean, I think it's impossible to not talk about the differences in the the gender of the character, because often like a male character tends to have more agency in a lot of stories, and this is something we're working on a lot in the in the writing community and changing. But because she's a woman, at least early on, they maybe leaned into this more passive role for her. And you can make an argument and say that it works for her character because she is very passive early on, and then she kind of like, as the story progresses, it's about her achieving agency. So I'm not trying to like cut the story down or anything when I mention these things. It's just something that I notice as a writer myself, and it's choices that creators make.
When she heads into the castle, there's no one inside, and she heads over to the fire. And while she's sitting there, she realizes that the fire is alive, and he introduces himself as Calcifer, a fire demon. And fairly quickly, she asks, since you're a fire demon, can you break my curse? And he agrees that he will break her curse, and says that he can if she breaks his curse first, which neither can tell each other what the curse is.
It's like a shortened version of the conversation they have in the novel. I like it. It gets to the point faster, and it says, clear quid pro quo. Yeah, you help me, I'll help you.
So, what do you think about Calcifer movie versus film? While we're talking about him,
I mean,
or movie versus book.
Yeah. That's yeah. I knew what you meant. I mean, he's Billy Crystal here, and because of that, he's a character. He's cracking wise, and he's making jokes, and I like him. I think when I recall back to when I originally saw this movie, probably around the year it came out, Billy Crystal wasn't someone I was real familiar with, so I think it stood out less to me than it does now. But yeah, I mean, he's funny. I like him, and I like the character. But I think maybe if I had to give it to one of them, and maybe we can do this for each character down the row eventually. But I think for this one, I'm going to give it to book Calcifer. I think I prefer.
Okay. Yeah, I think I prefer movie just because of nostalgia, and I felt like he was like a little more. He's like all fun in the movie, and he's like more serious in the book. And like that can be a good thing for the book, but I think I just like movie version more.
Yeah, and I can't fault you.
Sophie falls asleep by the fire, and in the morning, the wizard Howl's apprentice comes downstairs, and he notices Sophie's there, but he isn't really fazed. He's like, when did she get here? And he goes to this door that has a knob on it with different colors, and 3 separate times there are knocks on the door, and he turns it to different colors each time, and he puts on this disguise and like pulls it over himself, and it's like a hood with a beard, and it makes this young kid look like an old little man, and he takes care of whatever the needs of these people are. So he handles all that, and then Sophie is kind of talking to him. He's wanting to make breakfast, so Sophie's like, "But you have eggs and bacon here, so I'm gonna make it." She uses the pan, goes over Calcifer, makes the food, and Markle notes that the only person that can do that is Howl. And right then, Howl bursts in the door, and he is not really fazed that she's there either. He kind of just goes up and says, like, "What are you doing here? What's up? Let me finish cooking." And she says that I'm the new cleaning lady because I've never seen somewhere this dirty. And he kind of just shrugs it off and is like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is right from the novel. The breakfast cooking scene is almost identical. I did want to mention that Markle, who I believe is named Michael in the book, unless I was mishearing it on the audiobook. Regardless, that character has been aged down for the movie. He's like, I don't know, probably 8 or something. Whereas in the book, I think he's said to be 15.
Yeah, he's like a teenager.
And actually, yeah, and he's like a love interest for Letty. So it's different, quite different. And their relationship, I think, is a little different because of it. There's maybe a little bit more motherly attitude between them than there was in the book.
Yeah, there's a bit, but by the end of it, he kind of feels like a surrogate son for the family. Yeah. So it kind of works for me. But I also really enjoyed seeing a different take in the novel, where it was like a real apprentice that was learning the spells from Howl and seemed to be like more not in Howl's league, but on his way to being a powerful wizard as well, whereas I felt like Markle is just like very young.
There's a subtle thing that begins to happen here, and it continues and it becomes more apparent as it goes. But initially, she is like she is super old and she's really bent. She's so bent over. There's a funny scene where she gets up from the bed and she actually, like, her head doesn't move levels at all. She stands up essentially in the same exact position she is sitting on the bed because she's so bent over. But then as we go and we see her doing all these things, she's starting to stand a little straighter, right? And that continues to be a thing where she starts to seem much more like a young person who looks a little bit old. And then we even get some breakthrough kind of moments where she looks young and then goes back to being old. And we can talk about those as they happen. But I just wanted to say I like the subtle things that Miyazaki does early to indicate that this is a thing that, like, is going to be throughout. She's going to be slightly changing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that it's almost like a spectrum here, because it's like there's her young form and her old form, and then she like fluctuates in between, because like you say, sometimes she's old but she stands straight up, so she's a bit younger. Sometimes she has white hair but she's full young. She looks completely young but she just still has the white hair, and then other times she's full young with the dark hair. And so it's not like it fluctuates. It's not like it goes old to young. It goes old to middle to young to back to very old, and all over the spectrum there. So Howl asks Sophie what's in her pocket when they're eating breakfast, and she pulls out a piece of paper that she didn't know was in there. We're supposed to assume that the Witch of the Waste put it there, and Howl opens it up. It drops on the table, and it's a spell that like creates like a burn in the table. And I think we're supposed to take it as like a tracking spell, because right after that, Howl stands up and says that we need to move the castle, and tells Calcifer we need to move. But I just really like that animation and that moment where Howl shows his powers for the first time, and he makes that burn disappear from the table.
There's a really cool thing with Howl in general whenever he does magic where his hair starts like lifting up and moving on its own. And it's like, it's a subtle thing, but it's also like this clear sense of power and magic that it's coming out of him.
Yeah. So Turnip Head didn't actually come into the castle with Sophie when she first entered, and the next day she's cleaning the house, and Markle's kind of helping her, but he's like kind of hiding stuff in his room, trying to move stuff around.
Witch on a rampage.
Yeah, she's on a rampage. She was. I mean, the full. I think you posted on our social media at some point the cleaning GIF, and I mean, it's so good.
It's good.
It's so good. She's got like the handkerchief over the face as well as on the head, and so she's cleaning everything. They eventually find that Turnip Head is like stuck in the gears of the castle, so he's like still around. And the three of them kind of finish cleaning together, and they hang up. They stop the castle and they hang up clothes. And there's kind of this moment, like you were saying before, of those. It gives the moment. It gives the movie a moment to breathe. We kind of take time to look at the view, and she talks about how this is like one of her most relaxing days or something like that. We cut during this relaxing cleaning scene. We cut to Howl, who's a black bird in this war-torn area during a battle, and then basically we cut right back to Sophie and them cleaning.
She has this moment where she walks out the castle door, and they're like walking along the edge of a cliff or something, and she's really impressed by it. And she runs back inside and tells Calcifer, "I love your spark," or whatever, giving him this like, compliment, and then he gets all excited, and that I think was a really cool moment that isn't really in the book, and it helps. She references it again later where she's really kind to him, and it makes us like Sophie more. It makes us buy her friendship with Calcifer more. There's some really nice emotional touches that Hayao Miyazaki brings to this story that I think strengthens a lot of these connections between these characters.
Definitely. And I talked about how before I felt like this is more of a romantic like love story, whereas in the novel, I think we both agreed that it didn't really feel like the love story was quite as earned. And I think it's mostly because of this does a good job of like kind of selling it throughout, while it also is like it's not like so obvious, but it's always kind of there. There's always like that tension, and it's slowly leading to that.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot to mention that early on, there's immediately clearly an attraction between them, and they're kind of flying through the air, him holding her up moment. She's clearly, taken with him, and yeah, I think from the jump, this is much more a story about their romance. And we immediately feel the strain of her being in an old woman's body, and the strain that puts on their potential romantic relationship.
Yeah, and jumping off of that, so I was saying Howl was in the war-torn area during a battle, and I mean, it's just showing the destruction. There's just like a city on fire. He's flying around. There's creatures. There's creatures flying around that he kind of fights and mostly runs from.
Yeah, I wanted to speak on that specifically. He says they are wizards who turned themselves into monsters for the king. And then Calcifer says, they'll never be able to come back from that. And if you take that as a thematic thing, and you take that as a symbolic thing, right? It's these people, these like maybe scientists and brilliant minds who turn their work towards creating weapons of destruction and turn their work towards harm. And Miyazaki making the statement that they'll never be able to come back from that, I think is telling, right? It's something that you should not do because it will stain you.
Yeah, and the fact that you haven't seen The Wind Rises and you just said those words makes me think that you're really gonna like The Wind Rises, because I won't. There's no spoilers. I'm not gonna give you any spoilers, but basically the idea behind The Wind Rises is there's a young man who becomes an engineer, and he falls in love with planes, and he just happens to be coming up and inventing planes during pre-World War II times. There's not much fantasy to it, and it's kind of Miyazaki at his most human, but I think you'll really enjoy that movie because it's a lot of that, a lot of people using their gifts and the things that they love, because Miyazaki, clearly from a lot of his work, loves flying. There's a lot of flying in all of his films, and the idea of flight and seeing your love turned into like a weapon of destruction is kind of a running theme in like a lot of his stuff.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, when Howl gets back, he lands and opens the door and is walking into the castle, and he's transforming back from this bird form that he had been in. He had been in like this feathery black form, and he walks up to Calcifer and he's talking to him a little bit, like you said, about the wizards becoming these creatures and how they won't be able to turn back, and that's kind of giving us a hint that if Howl keeps turning into these weird creatures, he might not be able to turn back. And he also, in this scene, sees Sophie sleeping. And when Sophie's sleeping, she's her younger self. She's no longer old. She has brown hair. She's young looking, as she had been in the beginning of the film. And this is kind of interesting because we don't know for a fact as the reader in the novel that Howl knew that Sophie was actually under a curse until late in the book. And this is very early on. We know that he knows that she's not actually an old woman. There's a curse that's going on.
Yeah.
So the next day, Sophie and Markle go to the market, and Sophie is old again, and they see a ship that's been attacked and it's on fire, and there's soldiers jumping off of the ship and just showing the horrors of war. And even the characters, Sophie says she can't stand it, and they have to leave. When they get back to the castle, Howl has a freak out because the day before, when Sophie had been cleaning, she cleaned the bathroom and she moved around his potions or his spells that were in the bathroom, and he runs downstairs with orange hair. And he's not happy about that. He feels like beauty is his whole thing. So the fact that he's no longer beautiful and he has orange hair is really affecting to him. And so he sulks and is very, very over the top upset. And he leans over, and these dark demon creatures start summoning on the walls, and he turns into this green slime monster. And Sophie, he makes a comment about how he's no longer beautiful, so there's no reason to live. And Sophie starts crying and runs outside into the rain because she says that it's not fair that he feels that way when she feels that she's never been beautiful, and she's like crying in the rain. And it's just more of that idea that she sees herself through this lens of ugliness, when it's the themes that are going on are, it's not what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside. It's what kind of person you are, and people are going to love you for who you are regardless of how you look. So
yeah, and it's a cool moment right from the book. I think this is a lot more of the Howl. This is the Howl from the book more, right? This is how he is most of the time in the book. He can be very childish. He's very vain in the book. I like that they included this part because I think it's an essential thing for his character, especially that's something that he seems to kind of get over through his relationship with Sophie. But yeah, this kind of thing is a lot more present in the book.
Yeah, and so Sophie she's outside crying, and Turnip Head actually shows up and is like holding an umbrella out for her, and she kind of works through it and like rises back up and goes inside to help Howl, and because Howl's slime had been like almost covering Calcifer, killing him, and she dragged him upstairs, threw him in the bath, and Markle was supposed to like wash him off.
Yeah, and we see some Howl butt here. I thought it was a really funny moment too, where she looks down and sees that the towel has come off, and then like looks at the sky, you know, and it was something that also was kind of missing from the book. There was this whole thing where she takes him in, like scrubs him off and all this stuff, and I remember thinking like, you know, what's she seeing in this moment? So I don't know, maybe that's immature of me, but I thought it was funny to see it addressed here, and her reaction is priceless.
I mean, yeah, my girlfriend mentioned the same thing. Like, we were like, oh, there's Howl butt. And so what's funny is that at first it's just like half butt. And then like as she's dragging him upstairs, it's like full Howl butt, like full.
Yeah. Some animated cheeks.
So Howl is kind of recovering from this freak out that he has, and he's in his room. And I wrote down something that I feel... I think that Howl's room and like the kind of things that are going on in there is the most interesting location in my opinion. Like, it's like there's more beautiful locations that are more sprawling landscape, but like it's so interesting to see all the things that were in there that Miyazaki crafted and thought of, and just little intricate bits and bobs and magical spells things.
Yeah, really cool, like just baubles everywhere and devices, and later it kind of transforms and looks like a dragon's horde. Now, whether or not that was a dream, we can talk about, but yeah, there's just a lot of cool stuff that goes on in there. I agree.
So while Hal is recovering, Sophie's kind of trying to help him out. And earlier I should have said that Markle is given an invitation to give to Hal to go to be summoned to the kingdom, to the king. And Hal doesn't want to do it because he is this slitherer outer from the novel. He doesn't want to be at the beck and call of a king, and he realizes that he should have Sophie go instead. So he's like, you're gonna go instead. I'm gonna watch over you. Everything's gonna be fine. He gives her this ring with a jewel in it, and she's on her way. And she goes to the palace. While she's walking up the steps, or before she gets to the steps, the Witch of the Waste shows up, and she's being carried again by her ink soldiers. And she kind of talks to Sophie about what she's doing here, how everything's working out for her, which isn't great. The Witch of the Waste says that she'd been summoned by the king, and by the time they get to the stairs, the Witch of the Waste magic won't work anymore, so they have to walk up the steps, and they're both fairly old, and the Witch of the Waste is rather large. So walking up is a lot of effort, but it's more than that, because it's like every step she takes, she's like melting and like becoming less powerful. And the whole time Sophie's like walking up the steps ahead of her, kind of like saying like, hurry up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great scene, and we'd be remiss to not mention the little weird dog that she assumes is Howl at first, but we later learn isn't. Bizarre little dog, makes the funniest little like inhale bark, and seems to have chicken feet often when you look at it.
He has weird chicken feet.
Which is very weird. But funny little dog, and it's the whole time it does funny things, and she has to carry it, and it's just like limp on it. And this is another great moment for Sophie's character, because we see her like while she asks the witch to lift the curse, and has clearly got some bad blood towards her because of it. She also is like supportive, and she while in a kind of a funny way, she's like, come on, you can do it, this is what you've been waiting for, and kind of roots her on while she's coming up the stairs. And this version of Sophie I really like, because she has this kindness that even extends to her enemies.
When the Witch of the Waste finally gets to the top, and Sophie's a little bit further ahead, the Witch of the Waste looks inside and sees a chair and greedily runs up to it and sits down immediately. And this weird thing happens while Sophie kind of slips into the next room. All these lights come on, and some sort of like spell is going on. We don't see anything else from that, because Sophie's in the next room and she's meeting with the king's wizard, who is Madame Suliman. And Madame Suliman, interestingly enough, is kind of an amalgamation of two characters from the novel. Penstemon was the teacher of Howl, and Wizard Suliman was a man who was a wizard for the king. So it's like the merging of those two characters, because Madame Sullivan from the film says that Howl trained underneath her and then eventually ran away because he fell into a curse with a demon.
And this is a amalgamation of two scenes, which is really expertly done, because this is the scene where Sophie meets the king, blended with the scene where she sits down with Penstemon in the book.
Exactly. Suliman tells Sophie that Howl is dangerous and that has this curse, and Sophie says he's not going to serve the king. I think she says something about him being a coward, like that's similar to the novel, and they kind of go back and forth. And then Sophie says Howl's not going to come to the castle. Madame Suliman says if he comes to the castle, I'll lift the curse on him from the demon, but if he doesn't, this will happen to him. And then they cart in the Witch of the Waste, who is basically like a puddle at this point. Suliman says that she's lost all of her power. She's very docile. She can't even really talk at this point. This is kind of when Sophie's saying like, okay, well, Howl's not going to show up. He's not going to. And Suliman says that's not true. He's going to show up. Next thing we know, the king lands on these there's these flying devices that I think we kind of mentioned earlier, but they're steampunk-ish. It's kind of flapping wings on it, and you stand on it.
Look like dragonflies.
Exactly. The king lands, and he comes inside, and he's talking to Suliman and Sophie, and he's like, tell Wizard Howl not to come. We don't want to use magic to win this war. And then, wouldn't you know it, another king walks in that looks exactly the same. And this king says, he's talking about battle plans kind of, and he kind of comments about the fact that Suliman has created this perfect clone of him. And he's like, that's a good clone. That's a pretty good, I haven't seen you make one this well. And once he leaves, Suliman's like, hello, Howl. And turns out the first king that walked in was Howl. And Howl reveals himself, transforms into himself, and says that he fulfilled some deed that he needed to do, which was come to the castle. So he did that, and he wouldn't be staying. And Suliman tries to stop them. She's trying to attack Howl, and he's kind of biting on this bait because it was all a trap in the end. And he's transforming into the demon bird. And then Sophie tells him not to, and he realizes that he shouldn't, and they fly away, land on one of these little dragonfly steampunk machines, and they fly away.
Yeah, I mean, so much in that scene, but I particularly loved the magic and how it's portrayed, and the perspectives and the colors and the waves and just the way those things all interplay with one another. It's all great, and just a cool scene, high action, a lot of fun. I think it's interesting to see here the shift in power between the Witch of the Waste being kind of the antagonist of this story. And clearly now she is not, and this new Madame Suliman takes on the role,
which is very different than the novel, because Witch of the Waste was the ultimate villain in the novel. So they're flying on this dragonfly device thing, and Howl's like, all right, I'm going to distract them because there's some pursuers that are coming after them, and he kind of like splits into, there's like an illusion version of them and the real version, and Sophie has to fly this machine that she's never flown before. And in that moment, he also tells her that the ring that he gave her will point to Calcifer, where the castle is. So just fly towards the waste, towards Calcifer, and it's pointing out like a laser. So she follows that laser and eventually crash lands into Howl's Moving Castle. Like the mouth of the castle opens up, and she flies right in, and they land, and nobody's hurt. Something that I should have mentioned is that the Witch of the Waste had grabbed onto them and was on the ship, as well as Suliman's dog that you mentioned before. So Sophie, the Witch of the Waste, and Suliman's dog are all in Howl's Moving Castle now.
Yeah, I mean, and this is another moment where Sophie is being really forgiving of her enemies, right? Like, she's fine with the Witch of the Waste being there, and then the little dog, she looks back at it and says, like, oh, you were a spy for her, and then she goes, well, I guess it's too late to throw you off or whatever, like, kind of funny. But it's also, it's her just forgiving and befriending this dog, and it pays off for her in the end, and that she wins over these characters, I think.
All right, I think this is a pretty good place to stop and talk to you about Audible. We actually have an Audible affiliate link. It's audibletrial.com/ink to film, and what you get with that is 30 free days and 1 free credit for any novel in their collection.
Yeah, and if you wanted to keep on listening to this podcast now that we're done with Howl's Moving Castle, we are going to jump into Nothing Lasts Forever by Roderick Thorpe, which most people don't know is the novel that inspired Die Hard, which will be our Christmas release. Well, I'm really excited about that. It's one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite Christmas movies, and I've never read this novel. How about you?
Yeah, no, you keep coming to me with these novels that are the basis for some great films, and I had no idea that the novel even existed. So it's fun to get to go back and see these source materials.
Yeah, so we're going to be reading it for the first time together then, and if you wanted to listen to it on Audible, you can have it for free. Just use our affiliate link, audibletrial.com/ink2film, and you can go ahead and grab that and follow along with us if you want.
So here, Howl actually returns from the fight with the pursuers that were chasing Sophie and company, and he's almost entirely a demon bird right now. He goes to his room, and on the way, Sophie wakes up, and she'd been sleeping, so she's in her younger form, and she didn't turn old again, and she kind of follows Howl into his room, and I think, as you said before, his room, instead of being this small room with intricate little bits and bobs everywhere, it's these tunnels that go really far back in different directions, and all the things are like embedded in the dirt walls. She follows these tunnels back and finds this mass of black feathers that's kind of moving around, and Sophie realizes that it's Howl, and she talks to him about breaking the curse. She says, like, I want to break the curse so that this isn't happening anymore. And she actually ends up saying, she says she loves him, and he says it's too late, and he flies out of the castle, leaving Sophie. And she had been younger, and as soon as he flies out, it's one of my favorite shots in the movie, he covers the camera, and as he leaves frame, she's old again. So she like kind of becomes old in that moment.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'd forgotten it. But what I did think of is that when he says, like, go away or it's too late or whatever, he sounds like Batman from the Batman films. And I'm wondering,
where's Rachel?
I don't know that, like, do you know what year Batman Begins came out?
Yeah, 05.
Off the top of your head?
05, yeah.
05?
Yep.
So that's right around this time.
Right around this time. So
I'm wondering if he developed this before the Batman voice, and it ended up being a precursor to, I don't know. And I thought it was funny. But my main question about this scene is this a dream? Because it doesn't seem to have happened right after this, right? Like when she wakes up.
So I don't think it's a dream. But you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, and I kind of picked up on it, and I was like, that's the only place that he could be talking about a dream. The only reason I don't think it's a dream is because the next morning she like hears the bath come on, and I feel like we see him get into the bath a lot when like things have happened. Like at least we hear or know that he had taken a bath after like he had been the creature or after he'd been like slime, and he probably takes baths in the I'm probably wrong, and he probably takes baths without that having just happened. But I never really read it as a dream, but it's definitely something to think about. What makes you think it's a dream?
Well, he seems fine for one. Also, the room is back to normal later. And I don't know, like it seems like it's never mentioned again that he was this like weird dragon thing almost that seemed like out of control. And I don't know, I can't remember specifically if there's any more indications, but I thought the movie, like through the language that it was speaking to me in, was telling me that this was possibly a dream.
You know what? Now that you say that, I think it could be. I don't know. I'll have to check it out on my next viewing. I never really read it that way, but it definitely could be. Like you can explain away it not being a dream, but at the same time, the room being weird. Like the room could have like healed itself because the castle does weird stuff sometimes. But like it would make more sense.
Magic, so
it would make more sense for it to have been a dream. And she also says, "I love you." So it's kind of like, if that isn't a dream, doesn't it kind of undermine their love? I guess he's not really surprised that she loves him later. And I don't know. From here on, it kind of seems like they love each other. I feel like this is kind of that point, because the next morning, like you say, he's fine, and he comes down after having taken a bath, and he says they have to move the castle because people are getting too close to finding them. So he's drawing spell circles on the ground and of the castle and outside, and he picks up Calcifer with a shovel, which is like from the novel directly. And he stands and he starts moving over, and the rooms meld together just like in the novel. The castle that they have and the room that they're moving to melds together, and things move around. And in this moment, Calcifer flares up. And something I wanted to mention to you specifically is, I think that is Hayao Miyazaki's nod to the book accurate Calcifer, because he flares up and he's like purple and blue, and he has teeth and his eyes are crazy, and I'm pretty sure that's kind of what he's supposed to look like in the book.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I absolutely think that's what he's doing there.
So after they move, Sophie kind of realizes that the place that they've just moved into is her old home. Hal calls for her and she comes down, and he says that on the knob with the different colors that leads to different locations. I don't know if we really explained that in depth for people who didn't follow us in our book coverage, but there's a door, you spin the knob to a different color, it leads to a different location outside of the castle. So Hal tells Sophie there's a new one, and he spins to the new color, and they open it, and it's this field full of flowers. He takes her out there, they're walking through the flowers, and he says that it's his gift to her. At that moment, a bomber is flying over the location with all the flowers, and Hal is just like, this is what you were talking about before, where she asks, like, is it one of ours? And he's like, it doesn't matter.
Says, what difference does it make?
What difference does it make? So he kind of uses this crazy magic and like goes into the ship and like stalls it out and kind of makes it stop where it is.
Really cool.
But when we see Howl again, his arms are covered in feathers, and he's like turning demonic into that demon bird. And there's a bunch of creatures fly out, and he picks up Sophie, and they fly back towards the door, and he throws her into the door, and the door shuts behind her.
And there's a lot of, I mean, if you look at that, as we're talking about our themes here, he is forced to turn himself into this monster in order to fight against these other monsters. And the whole thing is about him not turning into it permanently, right? So there's, yeah, I mean, that all plays into exactly what you're saying, and about how you have to fight, but you have to also be careful that you don't turn into the thing that you are fighting against.
Right. You can't lose your humanity and your empathy. So Hal throws her back in the door shuts behind her, and he's out there fighting, apparently, because he stayed behind. And they're waiting for Sophie. Their days pass, and Sophie's waiting for him to get back, and she's kind of depressed. And the Witch of the Waste sees this, and one night when Sophie's kind of putting the Witch of the Waste to the bed, she notices, she says, "You're in love." And Sophie kind of accepts this and says, yeah, she's in love. She kind of thinks about it and asks the witch if she'd been in love, and the witch says yes once. And during this, we cut to another shot of Howl as the demon in another fiery battle. And there's creatures flying around and bombs being dropped on cities and villages. And then we cut to the next scene. Sophie's mom shows up at the castle, right? She just like knows where the castle is, shows up, comes inside. Sophie's there. She sees Sophie's old and it feels like it's her fault. And then she leaves a bag behind because she has to leave really quickly. And she leaves a bag behind, and the Witch of the Waste sees it and immediately runs up and grabs it, opens it up, and there's like a little slimy creature inside. And she knows it's from Lady Suliman and throws it at Calcifer and says, "Eat this. It's for you." And he eats it, and he becomes very weak and kind of goes down to an ember.
Yeah, it's a cool moment. It's also interesting because the witch here seems to imply that she has a lot more mental faculty than she's been letting on, right? Like, she seems like she has figured out that this is what's happening.
To me, I always felt like she was like getting it back. Like, she seemed like she was like slowly getting better. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe.
Or she was faking it the whole time?
No, I mean, I don't think she's faking it. It could also come and go because she's supposed to be extremely old here, and it's so I always took it as some sort of dementia almost, which is something that comes and goes in real life. So maybe sometimes she has more clarity than others. But regardless, yeah, I thought it was cool to see her kind of being more like surprisingly adept at doing this thing than maybe we didn't expect her to be.
Yeah, from here on, she seems like she's like really in control of her faculties, and she, except for one more moment, she doesn't really fall back into that state. Sophie's trying to get Calcifer to kind of flare back up, but he's like really weak and low. And Markle runs over and opens up the window because Sophie tells him to. And when he does, because they're trying to get some air to Calcifer. And when he does, right at that moment, bombs are being dropped in the area around them. And when the bombs are dropping, it actually affects the castle, whereas before it didn't. So seemingly, if you open the door or the windows are open, you can be affected by the outside world in the castle. And so Sophie runs outside to see if she can help because the bombs have been dropped all around her, and ooze monsters show up and they start surrounding her. And another round of bombs is coming, and they're falling from the sky. And this is when Howl shows up, and he kind of like redirects one and makes it not go off. He runs inside after that, and he goes up to Calcifer and kind of pulls the weakness out of him, pulls whatever was ailing him out. And he mentioned something to the Witch of the Waste that I wanted to get your take on. Do you think that was a nod to the thing that they kind of touched on in the book, where he had gone after the Witch of the Waste, and he at some point he had been attracted to her, and he went after her and then wronged her? And she was kind of, because he says something about we need to talk. He says like we need to have a conversation later, but we don't have time right now, and like runs back out. Maybe it's because she kind of poisoned Calcifer and he knew it.
Well, he also says something about the cigar. He says like I think I know where you got that cigar. So yeah, it seems like he, at the very least, he's kind of suspecting that she is working against him a little bit here, and is maybe not, doesn't have the best of intentions. And yeah, I think it says plainly that she once loved him, and it was unrequited, and that's kind of something that's been driving her.
Yeah,
wanting his heart instead of his head, like the book.
In this moment, she actually mentioned something about how she can't believe that Howl is not going to flee. He's going to go fight because he's headed right back outside. And even Markle, I think, and Calcifer make comments about it. And he says he has something to fight for now, meaning Sophie.
This Howl is a lot more heroic. This is something else I noticed. He's always going to go into battle and willing to put himself, risk his humanity and do all these things for the people he cares about. And it makes me like this version of Howl more. So, if we're talking about book versus movie, I think I got to give it to movie Howl as being the more likable, interesting character.
I agree with that for sure. He's more likable. He is less of the problems that I felt like the book version had, and more like heroics. So Howl is going back out to battle, and something I wanted to mention that you just said was he's not afraid to go into battle, but my second viewing this week, I realized that when he goes into battle, the times that we see him flashed in battle, he's in the battles, but he's not directly attacking or fighting anyone. So what they say about him like fleeing, they say like, I can't believe you're not fleeing. Like I think he like draws people away a lot. Like a lot of what he'd been doing up to that point, because he's not doing any specific like attacking, except for...
I thought we see him as a giant demon bird tearing apart an airship at one point, though.
That's true. Isn't that now, though? That's right now. That happens when he goes back out to battle now.
Yeah, so he's...
Up to this point, though, up to this point, he had been running, I feel like. Not running tactically.
Okay.
Like, he would fly into battle and, like, lure people away or kind of be, like, like the target. He would make himself a target, but he was never, like, going in and fighting things. So he was, like, kind of fleeing on his own, because it was, like...
He's trying to prevent the bombs from being dropped on these villages and stuff. So, like, yeah, he's drawing them away from city centers and stuff. Yeah, I agree. I think that is true.
So this time, like you said, he goes out into battle, and Sophie and everyone can see him out there, and he's just tearing stuff up. He's out there, and he's on airships, and he's huge and fully demonic, and he's ripping ships apart, and Sophie's like a little scared of that. And the ooze monsters are still trying to push into the castle, and as they're trying to push, Sophie's like, all right, we need to get out of here. Let's get Calcifer. Let's everybody leave. And so she picks up Calcifer on a shovel, and he's like, he's like, I need to go out last because the castle is going to collapse behind me. So she does that. She has him come out last, and the whole castle collapse. And in this moment, they kind of like run away and then realize they need to go back into the castle, because it cuts to Howl fighting again, and then they realize they need to go back into the castle to travel still. And so they go back into the rubble of the castle and put Calcifer down at the hearth. And he's like, I don't have enough power right now. It's wet here. There's like drips coming in because it was raining outside. And in this moment, I think what happens is Sophie makes a contract with him, because she offers a part of herself, and that gives him power.
Yeah, her hair.
And they're connected. And yeah, so she cuts her braid that she'd had the whole film and gives it to him. And he like is super powered now, and he lifts up a portion of the castle, and they make this little turret, fast moving castle that comes out of the rubble.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about how cool this is, like this new version of the castle, and then how it slowly disintegrates and starts breaking apart is all really cool. But I just wanted to say this is another trope moment, because she cuts off her braid and lets her hair down, which is like such a big 80s movie thing, right? Where like the nerdy girl puts her hair down and then all of a sudden she's beautiful. And it kind of serves the same purpose here in this story. It's just something, because I've been like thinking about that, I noticed that I probably slipped by me the first time.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that, because I mean, I see that now, but it seemed like I thought she was like making a sacrifice of something that she liked, but I guess there's never really emphasis put on her hair that she likes her hair or anything. So her cutting her hair doesn't really mean anything, except for the fact that people are supposed to see her as more, like you said, like that 80s trope of seeing her as more beautiful now.
You could make an like some sort of symbolic argument about the braid representing her being like tightly bound and tightly, like more reserved, and then her letting that go is like a representation of her kind of growth and freedom and letting herself be and all that stuff. So there is an argument to be made for it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's actually something here that we should mention is that, up to this point, we talked about how there's fluctuation, but up to when all of this stuff is going on, and in the novel we know that Sophie had been putting the spell on herself. I don't know if they specifically say that in the film, but the spell that had been cast that was keeping her old, she was keeping it on herself. Do you feel like there's a different reason, or is it the same reason as in the novel?
I think it's similar. There's a part where she's talking to Hal, and when she starts kind of being self-deprecating, she switches back into being old. And I think I think it's very much tied with her own self-image and her own confidence. And when she's confident and she believes that she's beautiful, then she is.
Yeah.
And she becomes that.
I definitely agree with that. That is the same as the novel, but I also feel like there's something about not as empathy towards others and not as much worrying about her, because I feel like for me what I've always noticed is that when it's either she's not worried about herself, she's sleeping is one instance where she reverts back, but she slowly becomes younger. She's still older looking with the white hair, but she becomes younger looking when she's kind of helping someone or dealing with something that isn't necessarily pertaining specifically to her. And maybe it just has to do with her not really thinking of herself in a kind of a bad way. So they're in this little turret castle now. It's running around, and Howl is still up there fighting. And at this moment, the Witch of the Waste realizes that Calcifer has a heart, and she's been talking about hearts throughout the film, and how she wants to get a heart, a young man's heart or a heart. And she sees a heart, and she goes and grabs it from Calcifer inside the fire, and she pulls it out, and she's kind of engulfed in flame, and Calcifer's there. And Sophie realizes to get them apart, she has to throw a bucket of water on them, making Calcifer basically almost go out. And the power that was holding the castle together, that mini turret castle that they were in, splits apart, and Sophie's falls over the side of this valley. She falls really far away from where Calcifer and the Witch of the Waste is. And she kind of gets up out of the rubble after a little while, and the ring that she's wearing is pointing again. So she starts moving towards where it's pointing, and she finds the door that they've been traveling through that takes you to different locations. This time she goes through, it's kind of a black veil. When she gets through it, she's actually in Hal's childhood. And I love this scene. This scene is unbelievably animated. The shooting stars are falling, and it's this field of grass at night, and they're hitting water, they're hitting the ground. And there's a young boy walking around, that's Hal, and he catches one in his hands. And Sophie can see from afar that he's talking to it, and then he eats it. And then something bursts out of him after he eats it, and he's holding young Calcifer basically, and then she's kind of dropped into this hole, and as she's falling she says, "Wait for me," to both of them, to Howl and to Calcifer. And as she falls, they actually react and see her. So it wasn't just kind of going back in time, it was affecting in some way, she actually was there. And when she comes through the door, Howl is there, and he's fully covered in feathers.
I had never noticed that until this viewing, that she tells Howl, "Look for me in the future," or whatever, right? And it's just interesting that there's this element of time travel that gets added to this story. And now all of a sudden, because I love time travel stories, my mind's racing, and I'm like, wait a minute. So if he grew up always knowing there was a woman who says, "Look for me in the future," after that moment, so he's always been looking for her. Is it like a causality loop where she made him involve her in a way that he wouldn't have without having this memory of this woman telling him, you know what I mean? Right. So I went down a rabbit hole of causality.
She also had white hair too. So he didn't really know who it was, and she had white hair. So maybe he was just going up to old women throughout his life and just seeing if she was the one.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and honestly, I don't think this movie thinks about it too much. No. But I thought it was fun to think about.
Definitely.
We got to do a good time travel book.
I agree. We got to find one,
because it could be a lot of fun to talk about.
I got a bunch of good time travel movies we can watch. I just don't know if they're based on books. So we got to find one of those.
I bet some of them are. Yeah. All right. Anyway, let's go.
Sophie comes through the door, and Howl is there, and he's completely covered in feathers. And she kind of pulls the feathers back, and you see his face, and it's completely. There's no emotion in any way. It's completely blank stare. And she goes to him, and she's like, "Take me to Calcifer." and he does it, but with no reaction in any way. So they fly over to where Calcifer is at, and when he lands, he just collapses and turns back into a human.
Really cool how all the feathers blow away and he's just left as a human. That was a cool scene. I liked his big one bird leg too. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, he's really, really demonic. It goes from like being like a bird like animal to being like weirdly unworldly, something we haven't seen before. Sophie goes up to the Witch of the Waste and she's kind of begging to have Calcifer's heart, the heart of Howl, we find out. Howl's heart back. It's Calcifer.
She takes the heart, and that makes everything falling apart in this castle. And that at this point, it's just like a little platform on 2 legs.
Yeah. So Calcifer's so weakened that that castle turret is literally just like 2 legs and a plate of wood, basically. And it's still running. It's still moving. And so Sophie's able to convince the witch to give the heart back because she just asks very nicely, I guess. And she hugs her and she says, if it's this important to you, then here you go.
And this is, I think, this is earned because she's been so kind to her that I think the witch ultimately decides to that her friendship and her sense of family that she's developed is more important to her now than her old things she wanted, like the hearts.
Yeah. Once Sophie gets the heart back, she says to Calcifer, "You can have another 1,000 years." So she has fully realized that she's a witch at this point. I think it's kind of hinted at throughout the film, but you're supposed to realize that she has powers as well. And she gives 1,000 years to Calcifer, and he flies off.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's as clear in the movie as it is in the book that she is a witch with powers, but there are signs of it, and I think it's a valid read of the movie, even if you didn't know about the source material, to say that she actually does have some sort of witch powers.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's less important. They don't really touch on it nearly as much because they kind of say outright that she's a witch in the novel. But yeah, in this, I first time I saw it, I had no idea she was going to do that. I had no idea she had powers until the very end. So she gives 1,000 years to Calcifer. Calcifer flies away, and then she tells Howl's heart to go back into his body, and it does. And when it does, this platform that Calcifer had been able to maintain, even though he was just an ember, collapses completely. Howl's kind of waking up, and this platform starts sliding down the mountain. And then Turnip Head shows up, jumps in the way, saves the day. He sticks his stick in the ground to slow it down and stop it right at the edge of the mountain. And when he saves them, when they get to a flat surface, Sophie kisses Turnip Head in what is a very convenient and less explained version of what happens in the books. Sophie kisses him, and that reverses the curse. She kisses him on the cheek, reverses the curse, turning him into the prince that had been from another country or something. I don't even think the king in this movie was looking for a prince like he was in the novel, but he's a prince from a neighboring land, and he says that he doesn't want the wars to continue and that he had a curse on him.
Yeah, and it's said that it's his true love's kiss, and we find out that she's his true love. And I feel like it is an easy explanation and it works, but I don't know. I didn't love it because it also is a little weird that Sophie's physical, kissing and her, you could say her sexual self is what is being bartered here to break curses and to break, to do all these spells. And anyway, the fact that she kisses him to reverse his spell, it's very tropey and it throws back to Sleeping Beauty and all that stuff. But maybe it's turned on its head but regardless, that's what happens in the movie, and it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine. I agree. It's something that I feel like maybe if he had more time or something, he would have put more thought into it. Which brings me to something that I actually did want to talk about with Miyazaki is that for a lot of his films, something that I didn't know until recently was that he actually would go into the stories sometimes and be storyboarding, drawing for the movie, not knowing how it would end or what would even happen in the movie, which just blows my mind because every rule of filmmaking, every rule of I'm sure you could, even writing, if you just start writing and, well, I guess writing is a little different just because of the fact that it doesn't take a ton of money to put a book into production, right? You can write it and then revise it. Whereas if you start production on a film, you're wasting money if you don't use that stuff in the film. So for him to just jump into it and have these I mean, he's absolutely a master to be able to pull all these movies off. There's one more thing that I felt like was a little convenient that happens here at the very, very end. Like I said, he just wanted to tie everything up in a nice little bow. Suliman's dog, who had been with them along the whole way since they were at Suliman's place, kind of barks at her and knows that she had been watching through this crystal ball, and she sees this and she says, "Oh, okay, so everything's better now. I'm going to tell the king to stop this war, and there's not going to be any more wars." Which is good because we don't want any more wars, but it just seems like a really, really easy way to wrap it up and have it in a nice tight bow.
Yeah, and it makes the, that Madame Sullivan like less of a villain a little bit. Like we kind of see that maybe she, her motives weren't all bad. But back to the kissing thing for just a moment. Sophie also kisses Calcifer, which is a weird scene. Like she kisses a fire demon.
She doesn't touch it with her lips, right? She's like a little further away, but she definitely kisses it.
I thought she pressed her lips against the fire. Is what it looked like to me. And this is another point of like, I mean, like as much as we're lauding Hayao Miyazaki, I mean, he is a man and he could potentially be falling into these pit traps. Sophie's, physical attention is given a lot of weight at the end of this novel, and her kissing everybody seems to be like the magic cure-all.
Yeah. I don't know how to feel about it because it's definitely not the message that you would want to be sending out, It's like that, like
it's an accidental thing. I guarantee you it's not something he thought about.
Yeah, I feel like it has something more to do with him trying to tie it up. And like you said, yeah, he probably wasn't thinking from the female gaze. It's mostly male gaze because he's a male.
Yep.
So
male point of view at least.
So he's deciding on things based on his own male experience in the world. So at the end of the day, he felt like a kiss is a kiss. Could be seen as a lot. Could be seen as just a kiss. But like you said, it is her femininity and her sexuality that at the end of the day is changing all of these things. And
all male characters that she's kissing who maybe have some sort of attraction to her. I don't know. Like ultimately, like she should be kissing Hal. I get that. This is what this is about. Her kissing Calcifer is the one really that probably goes too far. And then Turnip Head, like it's okay. I mean, like it's fun. He really is fine with her not having feelings back to him. Like really fine. He's just like, okay, that's fine. And then I did want to say I thought it was funny that he like hops away on a stick, like flies away on a stick. Yeah. I don't know. Since he's seen him as Turnip Head the whole movie, it was like a nice callback to that and to where he is still that character.
So here at the end, basically to wrap it all up, a lot of the characters are in Howl's flying castle now. Howl's moving flying castle that is flying through the sky, and I think Calcifer comes back, and like you said, he gets a kiss from Sophie, and they're all this like family that has come together and they all want to be together. And Markle kind of earlier in the film touches on it. He says there's a moment where he's like worried that she might leave at some point, and he's like says that he loves her and that they're a family, and she agrees. And this pays all of that off that takes place earlier in the film.
So there's a bonus feature where Diana Wynne Jones is talking to them about the movie, and I thought it was really interesting, and there was some cool stuff given there. But I also wanted to take a moment to read a quote that was shared with me on Facebook from Danielle Barnett, and it was from a very similar interview, if not the same interview. And I'm just going to read it verbatim because I think it's a really interesting answer. So the question is, were you surprised by Hayao Miyazaki's vision of the castle and the characters of Howl's Moving Castle? Diana Wynne Jones. I was surprised by Miyazaki's Moving Castle because I had not thought of the castle having feet. In the book I wrote, the castle is more like a hovercraft and floats an inch or so above the ground. But I am very fond of Miyazaki's castle. I have several models of it around the house. As for Howl and Sophie, both of them are gentler and more noble than the characters in my books. But I wasn't surprised by this. Movies are always different. I have several models of Howl and Sophie around the house too, and quite a few Calcifers, one of which sits in the fireplace.
That's awesome. I actually have a fireplace, so I'm buying a Calcifer in the next week or so.
That'll be sweet. Yeah, man, and I think it's cool to hear her acknowledge the differences in the characters, and she's fully aware, and it's cool to see that. And I just want to make sure we continue to give a big hat tip to her and for writing this source material and make sure that she's credited.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like with this film, her original vision does get a little forgotten. Other than the title card, she isn't really praised for this film. You know, I never hear anybody talk about her in conjunction with the film. So I definitely want to give a lot of praise to her novel, and she did most of the heavy lifting here. Hayao Miyazaki just kind of put his own spin on it and came in with the filmmaking perspective.
I feel like I'd be remiss to not say there are more novels that follow these characters. So if you can't get enough Howl's Moving Castle and you enjoy the book, absolutely go check out. I think it's like 2 more books, maybe more, that are in this series about these characters. So absolutely support the author and check that out. I think this should be a lot of fun if these are any indication.
Definitely. I actually am thinking about continuing in the series and checking the rest out.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I think we ended up covering a lot of the general stuff in the beginning of this episode, so I think this is about all I have to say. If you're finished, I think we're ready to call it on this project.
Yeah, that's a wrap on Howl's Moving Castle.
Yeah, so we mentioned it in our little ad, but just in case you missed it, next up we're going to do the book Nothing Lasts Forever, which is a incredibly forgettable name for a novel that inspired Die Hard. Yes, the original 1980s Die Hard movie.
Great Christmas movie.
Yeah, ultimate Christmas movie, in my opinion. Maybe I'll put a little poll out on social media or something about that. But it should be a lot of fun. We're going to read the book, I think, in 2 parts, much like we did this novel. And then we'll release our movie episode for Die Hard the week of Christmas. That's the plan.
Yeah, definitely. So look forward to that, guys.
Yeah, I hope you'll come join us for that. We'll be a little less family friendly when covering that movie, I think, but it should be the same kind of deal here. And if you enjoyed this, hopefully you'll enjoy that as well. So we'd love to hear from you, and if you'd like to get in contact with us about Die Hard, we'd love to get your take on that movie. You can let us know how you think of it and whether or not it's a Christmas movie. And especially if you happen to have read this, Nothing Lasts Forever, reach out to us because that's what we're going to be diving into. You can do that by sending an email to ink2film@gmail.com. Just say hi. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and if you wanted to, you could reach out to us on social media as well. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's at Ink2Film on all of those. So any sort of feedback or anything you wanted to reach out and say to us, we're pretty active on there.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun on there, and it's a good way to keep up with our episodes as they come out. The best way to do that, though, is to subscribe. And you subscribe, you help us out. And if you're enjoying all this, the other way you can help us out is to leave us a rating or a review. Both of those would be hugely appreciated. Help us to grow, and you can support us and support this podcast. Reviews like this one from Mr. Bald Jesus, which comes to us from iTunes. Great concept with great people, 5 stars. He also says, Bug Catcher Alex loves it, which I don't really know what that means, but we're glad to have it, and we're happy to hear about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. We appreciate it. So lastly, we just wanted to thank Audible for our Audible affiliate link. It's audibletrial.com/ink2film. And with that, you can help us out. And you actually get 30 free days and 1 free credit for any novel. They have a ton of audiobooks. So anything you want to read, go check it out. We also wanted to say thank you to Ross Bugden. We use his music from YouTube for our intro and outro music.
Yeah, subscribe to his channel if you want to check out all the stuff he makes. Lastly, I just want to say happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Hope you have fun with your family. Happy Thanksgiving to you, James.
Happy Thanksgiving to you, Luke. All right, guys. Happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you next week.
All right, I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
See ya.